Okay, in this video, I know you've seen the title. I'm going to show you how you can invest in the S&P 500 with no risk. 100% downside protection. I know you was just like, what's the catch? Don't worry, I'm going to tell you everything about it of how you can invest in the S&P 500 risk-free, 100% downside protection. Of course, there's always a catch, and I'll make sure I'll go over it in video. If you're not sure what the S&P 500 is, it's basically the top 500 US companies where you can invest in. So the top 500, thinking about investing in the top 500 US companies, and they call it the S&P 500. Now a lot of times they put it in an index. You can end up buying an index like SPY. But in this particular video, I'm going to show you how you can invest in the S&P 500 without losing any money, guaranteed every time. Make sure you sit back, get your popcorn, enjoy the show, and I'll go over every single thing you need to know when you would invest in this ETF. All right, so everybody know the S&P. It's this year it's up about 27% year to date. I think the average return for the average return I think in the past 20 years with the S&P is about 10%. Now, so let's look at this particular fund and see. So the name of this is by the company that makes these ETFs. They also have other companies, but the main company I'm going to go over today is called Innovators, and it's called Equity Defined Protection, 100% Downside Buffer ETF. So it says Equity Defined Protection ETF seeks one-to-one upside exposure to the S&P 500 ETF to a cap with 100%, that's right, 100% downside buffer against loss over a 6 month period, 1 year, or 2 year outcome before fees and expenses. So you get the S&P 500 ETF exposure, 100% down, 100% downside buffer, and a one-to-one to a cap. 6 months, they have one for 6 months, 1 year, and 2 years. These are like hypothetical situations. Defined protection ETFs, upside cap is, it says in this one, it says potential outcomes. In a hypothetical scenario below, the defined protection ETFs upside cap is assumed to be 16%. So if the S&P goes down 30%, you break even. If the S&P goes down 15%, you break even. Now, of course, they're going to cap the upside. So once it gets above that particular cap, you kind of max out your gains. The fund is composed of options. So in the ETF, you don't have to worry about this. You just purchase the ETF and that's it. Well, three components. They buy deep in the money calls to get S&P 500 exposure. They buy puts at the money to limit downside, and they sell call options that limits the upside. So those three main components that this ETF has. So it's mainly they use flexible options. So once again, they buy deep calls in the money for S&P exposure. Then they buy puts at the money to limit downside, and then they sell calls to limit the upside. All this together, they package an ETF. This ETF or caps are. So for the 6 month one, they have 100% downside protection, but it's a cap at 5%. And this one, I believe this is for. So this one was 6 months. It started in January to July. So this is how it would end up working if you buy it day one. So if you bought it as of June 28th, I recommend buying these the day of, simply because if you buy it midway, you have to kind of factor into other stuff. But the 100% downside, the cap, as you can see, is 5%. it it's really after you take in consideration the expense ratio. That's how they got 4.60. So after fees it'd be 4.60. So yeah, the upside was 5%. The downside unlimited protection This 0.40%, that's the expense ratio, and for 184 days. So this is just for now. In order for to get the 100% buffer, as you can see, this is a better chart. So you have 100% downside protection, and you have a cap of 5%. So if it goes in that 6 month period higher than 5%, then you, of course, you'll cap out. But on the flip side, you pretty much you can't lose money with this particular play. So that's how that will work. Now, in order, this is the key part about the video. In order to get the 100% downside protection, you have to hold it throughout the end period, the whole term. Now, you allowed to sell it anyway in between. You can still buy and sell anyway in between, but if you want the complete downside protection, you have to kind of hold it to the end. So with this, because it's like calls option and stuff, as time goes on, your returns will lag, and as it gets closer and closer to the end date, the returns will get closer and closer. But just know that it's like they do set a cap. So this is for the 6 month one. If we go back, they have for 6 month one, they have the cap at 5. For 1 year, these were in different months. For July, they had 9.5 would be the cap, August 8.8, September 7.5, October 6.77, November 7.4. And it's kind of all of these are based off of the option contract. And December 7.78% cap as well. Now for the 2 year one, they have 15.81, 18, 18.20, 12.96. So each particular month they would the numbers can vary. So the one in January, that one can vary too, and you'll know that that date comes up. Now let's go to the December one, so I can give you a definitely more detail. So it says the expense ratio is 0.79%. That's expense ratio. As you come down, you can see the cap is 7.78. So if you wanted to day one 11/30/2024, the cap 7.78%, 6.99 if once you factor into fees, 100% protection, so pretty much be risk-free investment. The cap you would get is 7%. So I'll give you an example in this scenario. So say the S&P for 2025 goes up 10%. What that would end up meaning, you would just the cap out after 7.78%, then you would only get 7.78% even if the S&P goes up 10% or 20% or 30. It doesn't matter. That's where you would cap out. So if the S&P goes up 6, you'll get 6. If the S&P goes up 5, you'll get 5. So you'll pretty much mirror exactly what the S&P gets until you reach that cap. But on the flip side is if we have a really bad year, you pretty much break even. You don't lose any money. So if the S&P has a bad year, let's say 10 or 20%, hey, risk free. So the thing about it is, you might ask, okay, why would I want to do that? Well, it could be two reasons. You could end up using this more like a fixed income, more like a way similar that you could play it like a almost like a dividend stock where that could kind of yield 7%. It'll be higher than the high yield savings. Interest rates are going down, which means the high yield savings right now they're like 4 or something like that. They're probably going to be declining. You could do CDs. It gives you a higher yield than CDs, and CDs are you kind of have to hold them throughout the whole period. This one you don't. Also, for if you needed, like I said, if you wanted to stay invested in the market, but let's just say you are a little bit worried that the stock market is overvalued, or the stock market might particular crash, or we did have, like I said, if we look at these, we did have 2 good years where it's over 20%. So a lot of times when the S&P were over 20% for 2 years, sometimes we had a down year. And you can just kind of go through if you wanted to look at what the returns was in the past and decide what you think the it will be, if it be worth your while. Also, if you maybe needed the money, if you were making a large purchase, maybe within a year or two, and you definitely wanted to earn some interest that are higher than the high yield savings or money market funds, and you wanted to stay invested, this would allow you to have a large lump sum in the money. I mean, a large amount of money invested, even if you needed to get that, like I said, the max up to 7%, which is not which is not bad at all. The average is like 10. Now, once if you keep in mind that even though the average is 10, you can like check, and I'll put this in the link below where you can see how the average returns is. So it's not like sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low, but like they say the average is um 10%. Now, if you buy it like midway, now if you don't, so I would say with these ETFs, buy them the day that they are released or the month that they come out, and each time it'll show you what month that it comes out, and it shows you the rate. So each month they would change based off of what the probability of the market will do. So the contracts and the caps are all based off of the option market. Now, for example, here, if you bought it as of 12/10, um, as you can see, your cap is slightly lower, 761, 683. The buffer, the first, you can say 0.16, but after you include the fee, the first 0.93, less than 1% loss, you would actually get that loss simply because you didn't buy it, the time period had already started. So the because you bought it midway, if you bought it at the very beginning, it'd be 100% downside. But since the option contract already existed, you have you have an amount you can lose before you get that downside protection, because this is 355 days and this is 365 days. So you would have for 355 days a little bit less than 1%. And then you have the remaining cap of 761, because as of now, this is how much the fund return is, how much the S&P 500 return would be. So if you buy it midway, you would kind of have to check the downside before the buffer kicks in. So these are the things you would check. You would check the remaining cap, the remaining buffer, and the downside before the buffer kicks in. So that's why you should probably buy it closer to the day that it was kind of released or the month that it was released. Here is the 2-year outcome period. And let's go over the 2-year outcome period. Now, as you can see with the 2-year outcome period, the same particular way the cap is this, and this one it's 1662. So after the 2 years, the maximum you can get, and you can see how much it went over the first particular year. So if you would have done that this particular year, you would have it really wouldn't have turned out well for you. And so like it always makes sense to get it closer to the day of, or like either the day of or the day or two after it. Thought this was definitely cool. Let me know in the comments whether you would do this, whether you like it or not. But that concludes this video. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the like button. If you're new, make sure you subscribe to the channel.